Contempt of court. The turn of the century lynching that launched 100 years of federalism. Chapter 12. God bless you all. I am innocent. Styles Hutchins had received a telegram from the Supreme Court at such a late hour Sunday evening that he had been unable to deliver the good news to his client. No visitors were permitted in the jail on Sundays after 6 p.m. Judge McReynolds received his notice late that evening while dining at home with his wife, and officials were unable to locate Sheriff Shipp until early Monday morning. Jailers awakened Ed Johnson with the other prisoners about 7 a.m. Hot tin bowls of oatmeal and metal cups of coffee or milk were given to each inmate. Johnson hungrily cleaned his plate. Seconds were not offered. It was not until mid-morning Monday that he learned from the jailers that his date with death would be delayed. His lawyers met with him in the afternoon to explain what had happened in Washington and what it meant to him. Pardon was surprised, almost perturbed, at his client's lack of excitement. Pardon and Hutchins spent much of Monday celebrating their victory. Numerous friends within the black community congratulated them on their achievement. They received telegrams of praise from black lawyers and activists around the country. Both men were feeling pretty good about their achievements. Louis Shepard invited the two lawyers and Pardon's wife to his weekend home on the Georgia side of Lookout Mountain for dinner and an evening of well-dressed, well-deserved relaxation. The meandering Tennessee River can be seen from his porch. It was a time of needed isolation for these men who had worked so hard to overcome so many obstacles. There was no telephone in the home, and no one knew where they were. For dinner, Shepard's housekeeper cooked a pheasant that the former judge had killed during a recent hunt. Pardon relived in excruciating detail his meeting with Justice Harlan. Hutchins and Shepard teased Pardon about his initial refusal to defend Johnson. That night, they toasted justice for Ed Johnson, as well as Pardon's success. And they discussed the future of the case and how it was likely to play out. Unbeknownst to any of them, rumors were spreading throughout the white community, especially in the suburbs, that there would be another effort to lynch Johnson that night. A frequent phrase was heard from the lips of many white men. Quote, "Tonight would be a real good night for a mob," unquote. Sheriff Shipp and his deputies quickly learned of the rumors too. With the election just over a week away, the sheriff was again feeling political pressure from his supporters. Many of them had complained earlier that Shipp had been too rigorous in his protection of Johnson. They frequently reminded him of what happened to another former Hamilton County Sheriff, John Skillerin. In 1892, Sheriff Skillerin arrested George Weems, a 25-year-old black man, for the attempted rape of a white farmer's wife. In that case, there was no doubt about the identification of the suspect. The victim had severely bitten her attacker's finger during the assault, and when Weems was arrested, the authorities saw his finger had been badly bitten. As Sheriff Shipp had done, Skillerin had sent his prisoner to Nashville following several lynching attempts. However, as the sheriff and his deputies were bringing Weems back to Chattanooga to stand trial, the train was boarded by a mob of a dozen white men. In an effort to save their inmate, two of the deputies jumped with Weems from the moving train more than 30 miles outside of Chattanooga. When 5 members of the mob followed them, the deputies drew their revolvers and held the barrels to the heads of some of them. Quote, "We told them if they advanced one step, we would kill them," unquote, said one of the deputies. Quote, "And I certainly would have kept my word," unquote, For 2 days, the deputies and Weems hiked through forests and across Lookout Mountain. Under cover of darkness, they finally sneaked their prisoner into the county jail, safe and unnoticed. When Chief Deputy Brown suggested that the sheriff post extra men around the jail that evening just in case, Shipp shook his head in disagreement. He said the talk of a lynching was nonsense. It was nothing more than hot talk from a few men who drank too much. Not only did the sheriff decide against seeking additional assistance from the city police and National Guard, he told his deputies they had been working too hard and gave them the night off. He said a single guard, Jeremiah Gibson, the elderly nighttime jailer, would be sufficient to guard the inmates that evening. None of the deputies offered an objection, readily accepting a night off from work. By 7 p.m., every deputy except Gibson had left the jail for his home. The prisoners had been fed and were locked down in their cells. Despite assurances from the sheriff that the night would be calm and quiet, the prisoners were noticeably uneasy. Throughout the day, the inmates had kept watch out their cell windows, looking for clues as to what the night would hold. If the others were nervous, Johnson seemed without a worry. After eating the breaded catfish served to him in his isolated cell on the 3rd floor, Johnson lay down on his bunk and drifted into a night's sleep. About 8 p.m., a group of men carrying pistols and rifles made their first approach into the jail. A black trustee who was working on the 1st floor saw them enter the jail and immediately tried to run. A few of the men grabbed him and hit him in the face and on the head with their weapons. His nose, apparently broken, bled profusely. However, the trustee was able to escape their grasp and ran from the jail through the kitchen. Gibson was making his evening rounds when he heard the commotion and voices coming from the 1st floor. Quote, "I guess that's another bunch of prisoners," unquote, he said to a few of the inmates. The prisoners weren't so sure. Instead, they begged him to call the city police department or the sheriff or the National Guard for additional protection. But Gibson instantly dismissed their pleas as paranoid. He told his captives that Shipp and the other deputies were sure nothing unusual would happen that night. Within 5 minutes, the number of intruders who had invaded the jail jumped from half a dozen to 15 or 20. Their talk was loud and angry. None of them seemed surprised when they found no law enforcement officers in their initial search of the 1st floor and office of the jail. In a workmanlike effort, they began their task of seizing Ed Johnson from the facility. There on the 1st floor, the mob was confronted with its first barrier, a large steel door with rods extending into the stone and cement foundation of the building. The door was fastened shut by a heavy metal lock. Immediately, the leaders of the mob called for a sledgehammer, which was instantly produced. It was as if the vigilantes had been formally informed of the various impediments they would face and had equipped themselves to deal with them. Grabbing the huge and extremely heavy hammer, the men began taking turns at attacking the blockade. The shrieking sound of metal slamming against metal echoed throughout the jail. Jeremiah Gibson realized the jail was under attack and knew he was there alone. Rushing from room to room on the 2nd floor, where most of the prisoners were being held, Gibson searched for a telephone to summon help, but he quickly learned it was too late. The telephone lines had been disabled. His next thought was to sneak one of the trustees out of the jail to the police station to get backup. However, he discovered that too was fruitless. The mob on the 1st floor corridor had blocked all avenues of escape. Downstairs, the hoodlums had made quick work of the first 2 obstacles, the large steel door and a smaller metal door, using the sledgehammers and a crowbar. Ed Johnson was awakened about 8:30 p.m. by the shouts of fellow inmates who were housed on the floor below. They were shouting his name. The only other prisoner on the 3rd floor was a woman named Ellen Baker from Ducktown, an extremely rural community east of Chattanooga. The deputies had moved the other suspected criminals to the second floor earlier in the day. Johnson didn't know why. Some of the inmates had their suspicions, but none bothered to share these with Johnson. Baker was charged with selling whiskey without a license, also known as bootlegging. She had been arrested several times, mostly for whiskey running. The police arrested her once for shooting a man, but she was acquitted after it was learned that the victim had threatened to kill her if she did not share her bottle of bourbon with him. According to subsequent federal investigative reports and sworn testimony, Johnson asked her what was going on. Quote, "There's a mob gathering, boy, and you're in a heap of trouble," unquote, she said. Quote, "You better check out that window," unquote. Johnson rose from a squeaky bed and cautiously walked toward the window, which was guarded by steel bars and glass. Peeking outside, he saw about 24 men gathered in the dusty courtyard in front of the jail. A few were carrying rifles and pistols. They were huddled in a circle. Most of the men were listening intently, while 2 or 3 others did the talking. When the group dispersed 10 minutes later, 6 of the men were wearing handkerchiefs on their faces to disguise their identities. Quote, "Why are they doing that?" Johnson asked. "You stupid N-word," Baker said. "They're here to kill you." Johnson could hear the pounding of steel on steel downstairs. The woman in the accompanying cell offered no comfort. Quote, "They're coming to get you," quote, she said. Quote, "They may be coming to get us all, but they're definitely going to get you. I wouldn't want to be you," unquote. Johnson could hear the voices of several men downstairs in the jail, yelling for the jailer to show his face and warning Ed Johnson that they were coming for him. Quote, "You better do some more praying," unquote, the woman said. Johnson was perhaps the most isolated man in all of Tennessee. His only solace was the cries of the inmates on the floors below, telling him to be strong and to beg for mercy from God Almighty. Once they had forced the first floor door open, the men turned to the right and marched up the spiral staircase past the second floor and up to the third floor. At the top of the steps, they were confronted with 3 more doors, all of them locked. These barriers that had been used to protect the public from dangerous criminals were now gates protecting the prisoners from a violent public. Together, they presented a formidable challenge. The first, a steel-plated door, was easily removed. This gave the mob access to several rooms on the 3rd floor, but not to the cells. The second door, made up of iron bars, proved more frustrating. It was considerably more sturdy, held in place by 5 steel rivets. Angry that the door withstood their initial efforts simply to rip it away in their hands, the intruders cursed Gibson, who was not playing along as they had believed he would. A second sledgehammer and an axe were produced, and the men immediately took turns pounding at the lock that fastened the door, and the rivets held the door in place. After several minutes of avoiding direct contact with the mob, Gibson left his hiding place on the 2nd floor, loaded his pistol, and ran up the stairs to where the mob was at work. Several members of the group quickly recognized Gibson as the jailer. Quote, "We need the keys to open this lock," unquote, one of the vigilantes demanded. Quote, "Give us the keys, and we promise to do you no harm, old man," unquote, said another. Gibson, his gun drawn but not pointed at the men, said he could not and would not give them the keys. With inmates and news reporters watching, the deputy told the vigilantes he didn't have the keys. An initial search of his pockets failed to produce the tools to undo the locks. He also warned them that he had called the National Guard Armory for assistance. The leaders of the mob were at first mystified, then infuriated. They had believed Gibson would be on their side and it would help them gain access to Johnson. Maybe he was offering this minimal resistance because he thought he had to as a lawman, they thought. In any case, the raiders were positive that no telephone calls had gone out. They also noticed that Gibson did nothing to hide the key ring hanging from his belt and holster. Within a minute of the confrontation, the bandits had seized the jailer's Smith & Wesson revolver, which he had purchased just a week earlier for $18. Quote, "Be careful with that," unquote, he told the men who took the pistol. Quote, "It's brand new," unquote. The riders said they would return the gun if he would give them the keys to unlock the door. Gibson nodded and slowly pulled the keychain from his belt. He selected a long, slender silver key. With the mob members watching, he slid the key into the lock's hole. He struggled for a moment trying to get it in. Finally, it fit. But then, as Gibson attempted to turn it in the lock, an expression of confusion crossed the jailer's face. It wouldn't turn. He was sure this was the key. Unamused, the intruders cursed Gibson and shoved him aside. They accused him of trying to delay their efforts. However, their attempts to turn the key in the lock also proved fruitless. They tried other keys, thinking the jailer was trying to trick them, but none of the others fit. That's when the frustrating truth set in. They had the right key, but the members of the mob themselves had ruined the locking device by beating on it with a sledgehammer and axe, so that the key no longer turned the bolt. After making several thrusts toward Gibson, the men resumed their physical assault on the door. They returned to the awful pounding at the locks and rivets, shaking the jail with each blow. About 9 p.m., Johnson again peered out the window near his cell. The number of people standing around in the courtyard outside the jail had swelled to 250. More joined by the minute. Whispers turned to chants. Speeches mixed vulgarities with Bible verses. The Ku Klux Klan was praised. White faces turned red with anger and hatred. Quote, "Turn the black bastard over to us," unquote. Quote, "Open up or we'll burn down the whole goddamn jail," unquote. The infuriated voices grew louder and louder. Even the few women in the crowd thirsted for blood. They shook their fists and stomped their feet. Some threw rocks at the barred windows. Their hostility fed upon itself. The words grew stronger, more malicious. A tall, thin man exited through the front door of the jail. He and others standing around him began waving their arms in an attempt to gain the attention of the crowd. When the audience was sufficiently quieted, the man announced what efforts were being made inside the jail. He informed them of the barriers and of finding the jailer. The crowd booed and hissed. One member of the mob threatened to get some dynamite. But the man, briefing the crowd, said dynamite was unnecessary. He was confident they would capture Johnson within the hour, and he told them they would need a rope. This sent the mob into a frenzy. Quote, "Friends, we are here for one reason. We are here for the sake of the purity of our wives and daughters and all of the women of the South. We are here to protect them from the savagery of the Negro brutes. We cannot stand by while Negroes defile and ruin our precious women. We must make an example of this Negro to show the other Negroes that they must leave our women alone," unquote. Of course, most of the people in the crowd did not personally know either Nevada Taylor or Ed Johnson, nor were they victims of black crime. They could not name a relative or a friend who had ever been raped. They were not there to mete out justice for a crime. Most of them were merely poor and white and very angry. They had always seen themselves as superior to black people. After all, black people had been slaves. They all believed white men were intellectually superior to blacks. But now, 40 years after the Civil War, the economic and social conditions of their world had changed. Black people were not only legally equal to white people, they were increasingly on the same socioeconomic scale, too. In fact, many black people were actually better off economically. Lower income white men found themselves competing and frequently losing out for jobs at the city's factories and textile mills. One man complained that the court system was too slow, too expensive, and too ineffective. Simply killing the defendant was the best and easiest form of punishment. Besides, he said, this was the community's method of sending a message back to the Supreme Court in Washington to stay out of their business. Ed Johnson peered down from the window of his cell. People were dancing, laughing, cursing. The revelry might have reminded him of the traveling carnival that came to town once a year. This was a game to the mob below. But these screams, chants, and giggles were not fun to Johnson. The other black inmates were in a state of total terror. They feared the mob might get them by mistake. Johnson returned to a steel-framed bunk. There was no give in the springs, which dug through the thin mattress and into the flesh of his bare back. He pulled the dirty green wool blanket to his chin, closed his eyes, and tried to concentrate on the 23rd Psalm, a passage of scripture that his mother had read to him as a child every night before bed. Johnson had stopped going to school in the 3rd grade and never learned to read. But we know from Ellen Banker's testimony that he had heard the prayer of David so often that he could recite most of it from memory. Quote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Unquote. Outside, the sound of gunshots interrupted Johnson's prayers and thoughts. He couldn't help hearing the venom in the words of the mob as they echoed throughout the nearly empty 3rd floor. Quote, "We know what to do with his N-word ass," unquote, echoed a voice to cheers. Quote, "Ain't no court in Washington going to save him now," unquote, yelled another. Johnson prayed louder, shutting his eyes and holding his hands over his ears. He couldn't remember the rest of the words to Psalm 23, so he started over. He repeated the same 4 verses again and again. Peering out the window one more time, Johnson saw that the crowd was continuing to grow. And they were more boisterous. Across the street, he spotted the new opera house that had opened just 2 weeks earlier. A large sign advertised French actress Sarah Bernhardt's appearance in Camille that coming weekend. Johnson had no idea who Bernhardt was or what she did to entertain people. He could not read the sign to understand the program. One thing he was becoming sure of by the moment: help was not on the way. Less than a mile away, Sheriff Joseph Shipp was sitting down to a late dinner prepared by his black housekeeper. After he and his wife enjoyed a glass of red wine, they began to eat baked chicken, rice, and homemade bread. But after only a few bites, the telephone rang. The housekeeper answered. It was a reporter for the Chattanooga Times. Initially, Shipp declined to come to the phone, saying he didn't like to be interrupted during dinner. But the reporter insisted, telling the housekeeper he had urgent news that the sheriff would want to know. The elderly black woman who worked for the Shipps for a dozen years delivered the message. The sheriff nodded, folded his napkin, and walked to the phone. The reporter apologized for taking Shipp away from his dinner, but he said he had just returned from the jail, where a large mob was gathering. In fact, he said, several members of the mob were inside the jail trying to break through the steel-barred doors that gave access to the 3rd floor and the cell holding Ed Johnson. The reporter told the sheriff that many of the men had guns. The county's top law enforcement officer offered very little in response. He thanked the reporter for calling and said he would walk immediately to the jail. After kissing his wife good evening and telling her not to wait up for him, Shipp began the half-mile walk down McCallie Avenue toward the jail. On the way, he passed the National Guard Armory and the City Police Department, but he stopped at neither. He solicited no assistance. About 9:30 p.m., Sheriff Shipp arrived alone at the jail. He was winded from the long walk. Members of the mob saw him coming a couple blocks away and warned the leaders inside. Quote, "It's the sheriff," unquote, yelled one man. Quote, "He can get the Negro out for us," unquote. Quote. As Shipp made his way into the building, members of the mob clapped him on the shoulder. Inside, he found Gibson in the office on the first floor. The elderly jailer explained to him what had happened. A group of vigilantes quickly surrounded the sheriff and asked him for the keys that would allow them to grab Johnson. Excuse me. Shipp insisted he had none of the keys that the men sought. Excuse me. He pleaded with the mob to cease their efforts and allow the law to take its course. However, he offered no physical resistance to the hoodlums. The loaded six-shooter on his hip never left its holster. He did not demand that the armed intruders leave. Not once did he attempt to restrain them physically. Nor did the leaders of the mob require the sheriff to relinquish his weapon. For several days, Shipp had heard his critics complain that he should not have been so aggressive in protecting Ed Johnson during the first lynching attempt. If he had simply bowed to the will of the people 2 months earlier and let them have the prisoner then, none of this would have been necessary. Time and time again, he heard people he knew and respected say that having prevented the earlier lynch mob might just cost him re-election. When the leaders of the mob grew tired of the sheriff's plea not to destroy his jail, several of the men led him to the jail's bathroom and told him to stay in there. No guard was posted at the bathroom door, and nothing was done to keep Shipp from leaving the jail. Even so, he remained in the facility. The leaders of the mob did permit a reporter from the Times to roam freely throughout the jail during their assault. He was there from the beginning and took extensive notes regarding the evening's developments. The identities of the mob leaders were not included in his notes. While the crowd outside the jail grew to a few hundred, the reporter said they were mostly inactive bystanders who were there out of curiosity, to support the leaders of the mob, or simply to watch a man die. Only about 25 men played an active role in the attack. About every 15 minutes, the leaders of the mob were successful in beating another rivet of the steel door into submission. Every time a bolt fell to the floor, the intruders in the jail would announce it to the ever-increasing crowd outside. At 10:15 p.m., the fourth of the rivets was removed, leaving one final barrier to the mob. Johnson sat on his bunk without moving a muscle. He prayed and prayed again, realizing the end was near. He no longer sought God's deliverance from the angry mob, but now asked for courage and strength. He just wanted the affair to be over as quickly as possible. He wished he could see his dad and mom and sister just one more time, and worried the mob might go after his family next. The excitement of the mob outside grew by the minute. It was now obvious that there would be no intervention by law enforcement. If the men could remove the obstacles and get to Johnson, it appears that if no one would try to interfere with their efforts, the mob had free rein. For 20 minutes, the men pounded away at the fifth rivet. Finally, a big, broad-shouldered man in overalls took the hammer and stepped up to the steel door in the stairway. Each time he raised the heavy gavel over his head and slammed it down with force, the entire jail shook, and men in the crowd cheered. The lock was strong, but this mountain of a man was stronger. His beard dripping sweat, he reared back again and brought the heavy sledgehammer down on one more mighty chop. Quote, "We're coming to get you, Negro," unquote. The hammer wielder shouted. Quote, "No damn Supreme Court will save you tonight," unquote. Quote, "You'll need all the religion you got yesterday," unquote, said another man. Quote, "Better be saying your prayers," unquote. Quote, "Guess now you're done sorry you done it, ain't you?" Unquote, added another. The fifth bolt gave way at last, allowing the determined men to remove the door. Applause filled the courtyard. The leaders of the mob took the keys Gibson had given them and unlocked the large circle door that gave them access to the third door. Stepping into the third-floor corridor, the vigilantes got their first look at Ed Johnson sitting in cell number 7 to their left. A wrench was used to throw a lever that opened the final door, and the mob had access to the series of cells where Johnson was being held. 6 men appointed by the others stepped forward to get the suspect. One of them pulled Gibson's keys from his coat. The lock on the cell door answered the key, and 2 men cautiously entered Johnson's cell. They expected him to fight, thought he would curse them, or even spit on them. He did none of that. They ordered Johnson to stand up. He obeyed, and spoke not a word as the men tied his hands behind him with a short rope and dragged him from the cell. It was nearly 11:20 p.m. when the thugs forced Johnson out the door for all the world to see. Quote, "There before the leaders of the mob stood the Negro, seemingly unterrified, but his eyes, long, narrow, bloodshot, rolling from one to another of his captors. One of the mob leaders stepped to Johnson's side with a short rope and throwing it over his prisoner's shoulders and drawing it tight, marched him out into the corridor. Johnson walked well, except when he was pushed by the mob. He held his head in the same lowly position, which it is known is characteristic of the Negro, and went along with the mob with his lips tight closed and his eyes downcast. The mob hangers-on welcomed them at the foot of the jail stairs and greeted with cheers Johnson's appearance. Then began these cries, which strike terror into the heart of the innocent, the cry of one human being thirsty for blood of another. Like wild beasts, for a moment, the crowd circled the Negro in their midst, but about him stood determined men whose plan of action seemed to have been mapped out long before, and who seemed determined that no hitch should occur in their arrangements. The prisoner was the calmest person in the jail. Not a quiver of the lip or utterance of a sound betrayed the slightest terror." Unquote. Chattanooga News, March 20, 1906. As the men stood on the jail steps showcasing their prize, Johnson quickly scanned the crowd, looking for a friendly or familiar face. A brief sense of hope came when he spotted a few uniformed police officers in the crowd. Maybe they were here to rescue him, to save him. Maybe they could disperse the mob. Had the sheriff called them? Was the National Guard far behind them? But all prospects died when he saw those lawmen laughing and joking with members of the lynch mob. They were part of the horde. Looking across the courtyard, he saw 2 men watching from the 3rd floor window of a building down across the street. The men looked familiar, very familiar. He was certain he knew them, but as he strained to get a clearer view, the leaders of the mob yanked him from the jail steps and down into the crowd. Quote, "Kill him now," unquote, demanded one man. Quote, "Cut his heart out right here," unquote, howled another. As the leaders discussed their next move, Johnson was bombarded with verbal assaults. He was called an animal, a brute, a beast, and names much worse. He was spit upon and kicked and slapped and punched. Stones from the courtyard struck his back and his head, leaving small gashes. A few men struck Johnson with their rifles. Eventually, blood trickled from his brow and down the side of his face. The hatred in the eyes of these vigilantes was like nothing he had ever seen or even imagined. He couldn't guess what had filled the hearts of so many men with hatred and ill feeling toward him personally and his race in general. Indeed, the grudge held by these men wasn't confined to Ed Johnson. They wanted to kill a black man, any black man. Johnson's arrest and conviction simply gave them self-justification and made him their target. Some in the crowd wanted Johnson taken to St. Elmo, the spot where the attack on Nevada Taylor had occurred. That would be the appropriate place to hang the culprit, they argued. They would send the strongest message to the Negro community. But the hour was late, and St. Elmo was several miles away. It would have taken more than an hour to drag Johnson to the crime scene, and the mob was too impatient for that. Quote, "To the county bridge," unquote, someone finally shouted. A tremendous applause erupted. It was agreed. The 15-year-old bridge that spanned the Tennessee River and connected downtown Chattanooga with a residential section to the north would have to do it. The leaders of the mob gathered around Johnson and slowly walked him to the bridge. They had little to say and made no noise, unlike the crowd surrounding them who yelled and pushed their way to the river. A newspaperman following the mob described it as, quote, "strange funeral procession," unquote. Near the end of the 6-block march toward the bridge, the mob passed an electric trolley car taking passengers home. Realizing that the rope around Johnson's shoulders was not long enough to hang him from the bridge, a leader in the mob ordered the trolley conductor to stop, boarded the electric train, and cut the trolley rope and cords used to ring the bell. Along the way, individuals in the mob taunted Johnson, telling him if he would just confess, they would let him go free. They dragged Ed Johnson across the wooden planks to the first steel span on the bridge. He walked most of the way. A few times, he stumbled and fell. The men would kick him and order him back to his feet. Quote, "To the second span," unquote, yelled several members of the mob. The men remembered 13 years earlier, February 14th, 1893, when a mob had dragged Alfred Blunt, also a black man, from the same jail to the county bridge. He was lynched from the first span for allegedly attacking a white woman. It was only appropriate that the second man lynched on the bridge be hanged from the second span, the men argued. The leaders of the mob complied with the request of the crowd and kept Johnson moving another 100 feet toward the next steel span that acted as a brace for the bridge. As they walked, one of the men tied the rope into a hangman's noose. Most of the crowd stayed a good distance away, like the spectators at a sporting event. About 50 armed men pushed their Negro forward. 2 men climbed, hand over hand, up the iron beam. They threw the rope over the metal girder and then looped it around the frame of the bridge. Task completed. The men dropped the end of the rope with the noose to the men on the ground. Almost comically, the other end of the rope fell to the ground as well. It was quickly put back into place. Quote, "Do you have anything to say?" unquote, a man holding the rope asked. Quote, "Confess," quote, screamed others. Ed Johnson, with blood dripping from the corners of his mouth, stood absolutely calm. He expressed no emotion even as the noose was placed around his neck. The leaders of the mob told him that nothing he could say would save his life, so he might as well confess. Finally, Johnson spoke up. Quote, "I am ready to die, but I never done it. I am going to tell the truth. I am not guilty. I am not guilty. I have said all the time that I did not do it, and it is true. I was not there. I know I'm going to die, and I have no fear to die, and I have no fear at all. I was not at St. Elmo that night. Nobody saw me with a strap. They were mistaken and saw somebody else. I was at the Last Chance Saloon, just as I said. I am not guilty, and that is all I have to say." Unquote. His words turned the mob into a frenzy. They cursed his name. They spit on his face. They threatened to find his family and to do to them what he allegedly had done to this white woman. Again, they demanded he confess. Then Ed Johnson uttered his last words. "God bless you all. I am innocent." Deciding that time was being wasted, the leaders gave the orders to hoist Johnson into the air. Several men grabbed one end of the rope and started to pull. Suddenly, the rope snapped taut, hoisting Ed Johnson's body high into the air, where he swung by the neck more than 100 feet above the mighty Tennessee River. For 2 minutes, his body jerked with life. A few men in the crowd grew impatient and opened fire. Round after round of ammunition was emptied into Ed Johnson's body. Johnson's mutilated body abruptly dropped with a thud to the wooden bridge. A stray bullet had severed the rope. With more than 100 spectators looking on, including women and children, Johnson's head moved and his body twitched. Quote, "He's not dead yet," unquote, someone spit in disbelief. A second fusillade of bullets rained into Johnson's torso. Quote, "Be sure he is dead," unquote, exclaimed several members of the mob. A large, bearded man slowly reloaded his revolver and then approached Johnson's body. He put the barrel against Ed Johnson's head and fired 5 times. Scores of bullets had literally torn pieces of Johnson's body apart. In a final act of desecration, one leader of the mob stepped forward and pinned a large note to the victim's body. It read, quote, "To Justice, Harlan. Come get your N-word now," unquote. With that, the scores of men and a handful of women involved in the lynching could finally go home. Their mission accomplished. 53 days after he was arrested for the rape of Nevada Taylor, Ed Johnson was dead. Quote, "Peaceful citizens in their beds last night, hearing the shouting which accompanied the line of march from the jail to the county bridge, and the shots which told too well the story of triumph of the mob law, shuddered as they thought of that monster of 1,000 feet and 1,000 hands and heads, swayed by impulse that was loose in the city, and though they knew it was against the Negro branded a brute, that their efforts were being directed, yet they were nonetheless easy on that account." Unquote. Chattanooga News, March 20, 1906. Chapter 13, The Honor of the Court. After emancipation, lynching was the ultimate expression of racism. During the days of slavery, few slaves were lynched because they constituted valuable property. No one would destroy his own wealth. Those who lynched another man's slave were prosecuted and severely punished for the loss of property. In addition, if a black slave committed a capital offense and was executed, the state had to reimburse the owner for the fair market value of the slave. During the first 2 decades that followed the Civil War, the number of people lynched climbed slowly. By 1892, the number of black men and women murdered at the hands of white supremacists had jumped to a total of 162. An overwhelming majority of those lynchings occurred in southern states. Indeed, 80% of the 3,693 people in the United States killed by a mob between 1888 and 1929 were African American. 2/3 of the victims were 21 years of age or younger. Half were married with children. Less than 10% had previous criminal records. Most of them were illiterate and had very little education. More than 1/3 of the people lynched had been charged with murder. 1/4 of the victims had been accused of rape or attempted rape. There is no explanation for the lynching of another 25%. Those who made up of the lynch mob could be divided into 3 categories. 1, those who took an active part by breaking into the jail and killing the prisoner. 2, those who were in complete sympathy with the active lynchers and voiced their support for the lynching, but took no part in it. 3, and those who were present merely out of curiosity. Not only did the onlookers make it more difficult for law enforcement officers to stop the mob, but their presence also implied public acquiescence in the activities of the mob and gave the police officers second thoughts about interfering with the mob. People who made up lynch mobs were generally less educated and unemployed, had previous criminal records, did not own property, and were frequent visitors to saloons. They usually came from the suburbs or rural neighborhoods. The leaders of lynch mobs were almost never arrested and remained relatively safe from prosecution by the courts. Of the 65 people murdered by vigilantes in 1906, only 3 arrests were made. None of these cases resulted in murder charges. In the few cases in other years when the vigilantes were charged with murder, all white male juries seldom issued harsh punishments. The men who dragged Ed Johnson's body from the jail that night of March 19, 1906, believed they would never be arrested. From the time the assault on the jail began to the moment Ed Johnson's body was lifted into the air, more than 3 hours had passed. During that time, not one sheriff's deputy, city police officer, state militia member, or local leader appeared at the jail to attempt to prevent the lynching. They all said later that they had been unaware of the lynching effort. The final bullet pierced Johnson's body at 11:45 p.m. For another hour, his torso lay openly on the Walnut Street Bridge. Even as members of the mob drifted away from the crime scene, curiosity seekers drove or walked onto the bridge for a better look at what had happened. More than a dozen women came by carriage or car or on foot to get a glimpse of the victim. An elderly black woman approached just as the horrible task had been completed and elbowed her way to the front of the crowd. As she neared the lifeless body on the bridge's wooden planks, she asked people who the man was and what he had done. Significant pieces of flesh had been ripped from his body by the barrage of bullets. Quote, "Is he dead, white folks?" Unquote, she asked. When the leaders of the mob answered in with the affirmative, the old woman shook her head in disbelief. Quote, "Well, I swear," unquote, she said, and walked away. Jailer Jeremiah Gibson had also followed the mob to the bridge. but he had no intention of trying to stop the men from completing their task. Instead, his primary mission was to recover the new Smith & Wesson the mob leaders had taken from him and never returned. Quote, "Have you seen the man who has my pistol?" Unquote. He asked the people he passed on the bridge. Gibson did not attempt to interfere with the hanging or write down the names of witnesses. He did nothing to apprehend those participating in the lynching. And he never did find his revolver. Not a single person was arrested that night. Additional deputies were never called in to investigate the lynching. No police reports were ever filed. As far as the official police records in Hamilton County were concerned, the lynching never occurred. After the mob dispersed from the bridge, a Chattanooga police officer walked over to Johnson's body and cut off one of his fingers as a souvenir. Well after midnight, a horse-drawn wagon from a black-owned and operated funeral home slowly made its way to the county bridge. 3 black men who worked for the funeral home scooped up Johnson's body, threw it at the back of the wagon, and took off. The newspapers, which had published so many inflammatory articles about Johnson and expressed such outrage at the Supreme Court's interference in the case, suddenly took the moral high road. The Times denounced the mob violence and declared that those who participated in it should be punished. Quote, "In circumstances of this kind, all that the good citizen can do is to bow his head in shame and look for better things in the future. In the presence of the mob spirit rampant in the land, we have nothing to expect but anarchy and ruin. If something is not done to stay the growth of that spirit, who shall say it will not be upon us full before we know it? It is a time for lovers of law and order and the friends of society in the home to take counsel together and see if something may not be done to check this evil that seems ready and able to run riot at any time its promoters may think it has provocation." Unquote. The reaction to the lynching varied widely throughout the city. Black people expressed their outrage by systematically staging a one-day work stoppage. On Tuesday, March 20th, manufacturing and textile plants across Chattanooga were idle because black men, who constituted a large segment of the workforce, stayed home. While most white leaders echoed the sentiments of the newspaper, declaring the lynching an awful event that should never be allowed to happen again, the business community took an especially critical stand up against mob rule. The business community took an especially critical stand against mob rule. They viewed the lynching as a horrible blemish on the city's image at a time when they were trying to position Chattanooga as a progressive, economic stronghold in the South that had none of the racial tensions that the other cities in Dixie. While nearly everyone condemned the lynch law, most leaders in the city also placed the blame for it squarely on the U.S. Supreme Court. They claimed the justices in Washington were just as responsible as the lynchers for Johnson's death, because they had antagonized the mob by delaying the inevitable death sentence. Quote, "No lynching would have occurred had the case not been taken from the Tennessee courts into the federal courts," unquote, Governor James Cox told the Nashville Banner. Judge McReynolds, District Attorney Whitaker, and Sheriff Shipp made separate statements to the same effect. Quote, "Had the federal courts not interfered and delayed the adjudication of this case, the mob violence we so deplore would never have raised its fearful face," unquote, said McReynolds. Quote, "As long as this prisoner was in the state court system, we protected him from mob violence and provided him with every benefit due to a man," unquote. On this point, the city's 2 newspapers differed. The Chattanooga Times condemned mob rule and said there was absolutely no justification for it. The Times encouraged an immediate investigation of the lynching and said there would be no justice without arrests of those who had been involved in the slaying of Johnson. The Chattanooga News, by contrast, took the position that the lynching was wrong, but understandable. The afternoon paper said Johnson had gotten what he deserved, and they blamed Pardon and Hutchins and the Supreme Court for inciting the riot. Quote, "The lynching is a direct result of the ill-advised effort to save the Negro from the just penalty of the laws of Tennessee. Had not that effort been made, the Negro would have been legally executed today at the county jail. There was not a scintilla of doubt in the minds of the jury that he was guilty. The news deems it timely to mention that this community was content to let the law take its course provided there was no unnecessary delay. It was the appeal to the federal courts that revived the mob spirit and resulted in the lynching. This fact should be a lesson in the future. There is no community south or north which will submit to delay and punishment for this particular crime. The Supreme Court of the United States ought, in its wisdom, to take cognizance of this fact." Unquote. Discussions on the street and in saloons all over town were not so analytical. There were widespread rumors that a group of black men would get their revenge the following night. There was talk of organizing a black lynch mob to storm the jail to take a white man who had recently been arrested for killing a young black girl. And there were those who simply advocated rioting by burning down white businesses and houses. Leaders in the black church immediately took to the streets and communities to suppress such thoughts. Preachers begged their followers to remain nonviolent in their protests. They applauded their one-day work strike as a sufficient statement of their displeasure, and they asked black people to seek revenge in more lawful ways, including at the ballot box. After all, the county elections were only a week away. No one was more disheartened or more outraged by the lynching than Noah Pardon. Convinced that Johnson was innocent of the rape, Pardon had invested his entire soul in the case. If anyone had a right to be bitter and desire revenge, it was he. Yet, Pardon was among those who pleaded for peace in an article he wrote for the Chattanooga Blade. Quote, "An awful event has taken us by surprise. No Negro should be satisfied with what had happened. Justice for Ed Johnson and for the Negro, as a people, has been denied. But it does no good for any man to react to injustice with mob violence. We have displayed our dissatisfaction this day by our actions. Let us not ignore the very laws we seek to protect us. Let us now seek just punishment against those who violated the laws of our state and country." Unquote. All day Tuesday, Chattanoogans, black and white, men and women, packed hardware stores to buy weapons and ammunition. Everyone feared a race riot, and no one wanted to be left unprotected. As a safety precaution, the larger department stores and grocery markets closed their doors early to allow the women who worked there to get home before dark. To help suppress possible disruptions, sheriffship recruited an additional 200 people to act as temporary deputies to patrol the county. The city police added a few dozen men of their own, and the governor asked the 50 members of the local National Guard to assist the sheriff. The mayor ordered all the saloons frequented by black people to be closed that Tuesday and Wednesday. He issued no such mandate for taverns visited by white people. The sheriff also issued a curfew exclusively applying to black people. He did not want to see any black people on the streets after 9 p.m. Law enforcement officials also rounded up the habitual drunks and those constantly charged with disorderly conduct and kept them in jail for 2 days, just as a precaution. For the most part, the racial confrontations were limited. There were no riots and no group clashes. Most black people stayed in their homes. A few prayer meetings were conducted at black churches throughout the city. The only violent incident occurred at a local foundry where a white employee was seen slapping a young black boy. When an adult black man sought to intervene, the white man shot him with a .32 caliber pistol. The black man died from the injury, and the white man was charged with assault, but not murder. Community leaders downplayed the shooting incident as isolated. They insisted that the two races were putting aside their differences and hatred. Most of all, city officials hoped the world would quickly forget the tragic lynching. It was a horrible event that should be left behind and not dwelled upon, they said. If the people of Chattanooga thought they could simply declare the lynching an event in their history and move on, they were badly mistaken. Other lynchings, indeed most lynchings, had been executed without consequences, but not this one. The news of the lynching reached the U.S. Supreme Court the morning after it occurred. Notified by reporters, the justices were stunned. They had never been confronted by such a situation before. The court found particularly offensive the note pinned to Johnson's body that condemned the Supreme Court for its action. Quote, "The open defiance of the Supreme Court of the United States of the mob that lynched the Negro, Ed Johnson, last night has no parallel in the history of the court. The event has shocked the members of the court beyond anything that has ever happened in their experience on this bench. They have met in twos and threes today and discussed the matter and the course to be taken to vindicate the power and authority of the court. No justice can say what will be done. All, however, agree in saying that the sanctity of the Supreme Court shall be upheld if the power resides in the court and the government to accomplish such a vindication of the majesty of the law." New York Times, March 21st, 1906. The morning following the lynchings, Justices John M. Harlan and Oliver Wendell Holmes met with Chief Justice Melville W. Fuller at the Chief Justice's home. The Supreme Court had officially recessed for the spring. However, they were so furious that they met informally to discuss the matter. At the end of their closed-door session, each expressed outrage to news reporters and condemned the mob's actions. All three rebuked the mob and said definite action must be taken. In an interview with a reporter for the Washington Post, Justice Harlan expressed, quote, "righteous indignation," unquote, that his orders staying the execution and protecting the defendant had been obviously and intentionally ignored. Quote, "The fact was that Johnson was tried by little better than mob law before the state court. A juror rose in the box and demanded of the young woman who had been attacked if she was sure the defendant was the man who had committed the act, and when she said she was not willing to swear that he was, the juror demanded that she should swear that he was the man, and he would get down out of the jury box and cut out his heart. There was abundant proof that there was intimidation of witnesses and counsel, and the reason why the court did not allow an appeal or a plea in abatement was the fear that if any such consideration was shown, the mob would lynch the prisoner. There was reason to believe that the man was innocent. But be it that as may, whether guilty or innocent, he had the right to a fair trial, and the mandate of the Supreme Court has for the first time in the history of the country been openly defied by a community." Unquote. An even stronger rebuke came from Justice Holmes. He described the state court trial given to Johnson as, quote, "a shameful attempt at justice," unquote. He also compared the judge and jury to the lynch mob. Quote, "This was not merely a case of a defendant claiming he did not receive a fair trial," unquote. Holmes told reporters, quote, "In all likelihood, this was a case of an innocent man, improperly branded a guilty brute, and condemned to die from the start," unquote. Holmes also scolded the lawyers appointed to defend Johnson at his trial for abandoning their client after the jury's verdict. Chief Justice Fuller agreed with Harlan and Holmes that action needed to be taken. He said there would be immediate consultations with President Roosevelt, U.S. Attorney General William Moody, and federal law enforcement officials based in Tennessee. The first two goals, Fuller said, were to vindicate the Supreme Court's power under such circumstances, to determine the parties responsible for the lynching. Fuller said that parties should be tried for murder, but he admitted that That was a state crime, so that the federal authorities would have no role in such a prosecution. President Theodore Roosevelt also condemned the lynching and termed the event as, quote, contemptuous of the court. It is an affront to the highest tribunal in the land that cannot go by without proper action being taken, unquote. By Wednesday morning, 36 hours after the lynching, the attention of the federal authorities was already starting to focus on Sheriff Shipp, U.S. Attorney J.R. Penland, whose jurisdiction included Chattanooga, believed that the federal government did have jurisdiction to investigate the lynching, because Johnson was a federal prisoner. Justice Harlan's stay of execution in order to the Chattanooga authorities had made it clear to Shipp and other court officials, Penland said, that Johnson was a federal prisoner and should be kept safe pending his appeal. Penland, a career prosecutor and appointee of President Roosevelt, said he planned to investigate the lynching thoroughly and, quote, if any of the participants can be identified, I will prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, unquote. If the newspaper reports were correct that the mob gathering had been planned early Monday, then Sheriff Shipp must have known that there would be an effort to lynch Johnson that night, Penland said. If this was true, the prosecutor said there was no excuse why more deputies had not been deployed to defend the jail. Quote, the lynching of the Negro was downright murder, unquote, Penland said. Quote, and somebody ought to pay for it. Okay, I can go a little bit further here. More than 2,000 men and women filled the Primitive Baptist Church sanctuary that Wednesday afternoon for Ed Johnson's funeral. His father, Skinbone, greeted people at the front door. Standing beside him were two black ministers, Pardon and Hutchins. Were there, too, was Lewis Shepard. Pardon and Hutchins were there too, as was Lewis Shepard. Only a few other white people were present. Friends Johnson had known from the saloon where he worked. One preacher sang and offered prayer. The other gave a quiet and almost introspective sermon. There was no shouting or screaming. The service was devoid of all sensationalism. Johnson was remembered as a soft-spoken man who had worked hard and enjoyed the company of friends. He loved to play pool and hated the cold weather. Asked to speak, Pardon thanked God that his client had made a profession of faith in the days before his death. He said that Johnson represented the courage every man needs to have when facing an unbearable situation. Johnson also demonstrated how much more black and white people needed to strive in order to achieve equality and harmony within the community. The service lasted less than an hour, and there was no direct mention of the lynching or Johnson's case. No protests or demonstrations. Only tears, hugs, and sadness. Johnson's father grasped Pardon's hand as the lawyer was leaving the church. Quote, for my son's sake, thank you, quote, unquote. He said, quote, God bless you, unquote. The next Sunday morning, March 25th, the lynching and its effect on the community were very much topic of many pastors around the city, and not just in the African American churches. Dr. McCallie and Reverend Bachman both preached on the sins of the mob to their Presbyterian followers. But the most unexpectedly critical sermon came from Dr. Howard E. Jones of the First Baptist Church. First Baptist was the city's establishment church for white people, the largest church in this community dominated by Baptist congregations. As a young pastor, Dr. Jones had always tried to disassociate himself from the political bureaucracy of the city. He never got involved in politics and seldom spoke about the social ills that faced the community. Instead, he was a hellfire and brimstone preacher who spoke on heavenly things and how to be a better Christian. Preferring to concentrate on the functions of his church rather than the happenings at City Hall. As a result, his church had grown to be one of the largest in the South. About 2,000 people regularly attended his Sunday morning worship services. Dr. Jones had been pastor at First Baptist for only 2 years, having been educated at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, Washington and Lee University in Virginia, and the Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. As a preacher, he was a rising star and an influential figure in the Southern Baptist Convention. As an orator, Dr. Jones was without equal. He had learned his preaching skills from his father, Reverend J.W. Jones, who had been Chaplain General of the United Confederate Veterans and personal chaplain for General Robert E. Lee. But as the younger Jones mounted his pulpit that Sunday morning, a heavy burden lay on his heart. The lynching had terrified his spirit and deflated his soul. That morning, he delivered a sermon that was discussed in every household in Chattanooga for weeks. The bulletin handed to every person who walked through the doors of the church had but 6 words in large, bold letters. Is lawlessness a cure for crime? Dr. Jones's message wasn't lengthy, but it was to the point. He knew it would be controversial, maybe even offensive to many of his parishioners. In fact, he worried that the church's deacons might run him out of town. Even so, he announced from his pulpit that he would not apologize for the sermon he was about to deliver. The people of the city needed to hear the truth as God would tell it to them. He then instructed the congregation to turn to their Bibles to Galatians 6:7 and began to preach the sermon that remains to this day one of the most courageous ever delivered. Quote, "Whatever soweth a man, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Unquote. The white man rules in this community. I am using an old phrase, oft used by you, when I affirm that he always has and he always will. The honor of rule involves a burden of responsibility. If the white man rules, and this community is condemned with a charge of anarchy and lawlessness, then the white man must face the responsibility. It is not enough for us to say that the responsibility rests entirely upon the officers of the law, because they are only our creatures. Our votes place them in office, and by our support, they hold their positions. Let us now briefly consider the events of last Monday night. They are not pretty nor poetic. Some 50 or more men, presuming upon the oft-expressed fear of a mob and impatient of law and order, went to our jail. With evidence of carefully premeditated program, they took the keys away from the one man who's to defend Chattanooga's honor. But owing to their haste to get at the bloody business, they destroyed with sledges the usefulness of the keys, and for 2 hours they toiled at the steel bolts, which were more loyal to Chattanooga's interest than all of her citizenship. But where are the police? And where are the thousands who should have and could have defended us against an unspeakable disgrace? And so the mob marches by a gallows, ready prepared with stretched rope within the precincts of the jail. They are not in pursuit of justice, but lawless revenge. Their business is to brutalize the community. Let the curtain fall upon the rest of that unspeakable scene. The worst elements among the white men of this community took over the reins of government. Was this disgrace ever rebuked? Has any arrest of those men who unsheathed their keen blades and struck deadly blows at the very heart of our civilization ever been effected? Does anyone here know of any attempt? But you say, we were afraid. Afraid? Afraid of what? Afraid of the most vicious, godless, ignorant, and depraved of the white men in this community? Why did we not stop and consider that anarchy was already reigning in our midst when a community was terrorized into a weak compromise with its most dangerous citizens? No. Quote, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Unquote. We had but sown the wind, and were yet to reap the whirlwind. We had cast pearls before the swine, who were presently to trample them in the mire and turn and rend us. We had given the sacred and holy trust of laws to dogs, who, despising the holy thing we had compromised, would presently be fixing their vicious fangs in the throat of our civilization. Not only a fair trial should have been given to Ed Johnson, but a fair trial should also have been given to every member of the mob who could be apprehended. No arrest has been made. No, don't blame the officers altogether. No, great, big, strong men stood up in this community and cried aloud in the name of law and justice for the arrest of those men. But let me speak plainly to the man who sees no more in the tragedy on the bridge than that Ed Johnson got when he ought to have had. Admit it. But how about the community? Has it gotten what it ought to have had? I maintain that that mob struck more terrible blows at the heart of our civilization than it inflicted upon Ed Johnson. The beam in our eye has prevented us from seeing this. So far as Ed Johnson was concerned, the mob only deprived him of a life which in all probability he would only have possessed for a few weeks longer. But consider what it has done to our community. It advertised Chattanooga all over this land and in foreign lands as a place where it is unsafe to live. It registered our city as among that class of communities which have only attained a very low grade of civilization, a place where intelligence flees with fear and trembling when ignorance clenches its fists and gnashes its teeth. Think of the number of people who today only know us as a city where 50 hoodlums can terrify us into passive submission to lawless barbarism. But the largest injury to the community has not been yet realized. Just as the demoralizing effects of war are felt for generations, so a season of lawlessness such as we have just gone through is as far-reaching in its own baneful efforts. Whatsoever a man or a community soweth, that shall they also reap. What a lesson for our children. The minute details of the horrible affair are discussed by groups of small boys on nearly every corner. I myself saw a picture the other afternoon which has haunted me like a ghost. A crowd of little boys were playing in a vacant lot, and I was horrified to see that they were in mimicry carrying out the revolting proceedings of the mob on Monday night. They went through with it all. They broke into the jail. They secured the Negro, represented by a large ash can, tied about it a rope, rushed, yelling with it to a nearby fence, hoisted it in the air, and then for lack of pistols, took rocks and did their best to riddle the effigy. I walked sadly away, wondering how many, quote, pistol toters, unquote, for the future were among those little boys. Wondering if they were receiving lessons which would prevent a better civilization. Quote, whatsoever a man or a community soweth, that shall he also reap. Unquote. Lawlessness begets lawlessness. It always has and always will. Sow an act of lawlessness, and you will get a harvest of lawless conditions. If this is not true, civilization is a farce, and anarchy is the best goal to strive for. The speaker scorns the need of denouncing the crime of which Johnson was accused. I could pile up every adjective, as did Hamlet at Ophelia's grave. I could utter overwrought denunciations, which would fall back like cold water upon the fiery indignation which such a crime stirs within me. And yet I should find myself saying, apologetically, as did the sweet Prince of Denmark, quote, I can rant as well as thou, unquote. But this is not a time for ranting. I resent the crime on the bridge because of my unspeakable indignation against the crime at St. Elmo. To give over our dealing with this atrocity to lawless procedure means that over and over again, not only the innocent man hangs, but the guilty man remains free, as a threat to the sanctity of our homes. To me not, with the pages of history open before me, that a mob ever helped civilization. Excuse me. It is a blind Frankenstein monster, and its only power is force. It cannot think. It cannot reason. The most terrible of all, it cannot love. It is born of the hate of hell, and has done more in this history of humanity to degrade civilization, laugh in the face of righteousness, and defy the majesty of God than has any other monster who ever issued from the pit. Blow the dust off your Barbany Rigby, and let Dickens tell you of the mobs of London. Get down your Carlyle's French Revolution, and let him show you how France lost her chance among the nations of the world through the mobs of the Reign of Terror. Take your place in the gray dawn of that fatal Friday outside the Prematorium, where Pontius Pilate stands before the fury of a mob and presents the only sinless one who ever lived, and say, quote, behold the man, unquote. Hear the hoarse cry of that awful creature, the mob, as with gathering force it answers back, quote, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, unquote. And then stand forth and tell me if you hope by the force and fury of a mob to accomplish anything but to destroy the best and crucify the holiest, unquote. In Washington, D.C., officials were afforded a different view of the Southern attitude than that supplied by Dr. Jones. The very Sunday morning of that amazing sermon, the Washington Post published a front-page article written by J.G. Rice, the editor of the Chattanooga News. He defended the local court's actions against Ed Johnson, asserting that no one doubted Johnson's guilt, and that the defendant was afforded one of the fairest trials ever given in Chattanooga. However, the newsman unchangedly contradicted Judge McReynolds and Sheriff Shipp in regard to the allegation that black people were intentionally kept off juries. Quote, that allegation is a fact. The South long ago decided this to be a white man's government, and there's no appeal in Hamilton County from that decision. If that is treason, our critics are invited to make the most of it. It has been an unwritten law in the South since the memory of man runneth, not to the contrary, that the black man who assaults a white woman shall die. This law maintains in every Southern state and is higher than any statutory law. And when once it is made certain that the guilty man has been captured, there is not power enough in the United States Army to save him. I hold that the worthless, shiftless, criminal black brute who outrages a white woman has no more rights under the law than a servant, unquote. Members of the Supreme Court, meeting privately in the home of Chief Justice Fuller, read the article that Sunday morning with great interest. It was obvious to them that the lynching had arisen out of a contempt for the court and its ruling. After a lengthy discussion, they agreed they should take action separate from any charges brought by the state or federal authorities, for the lynching was an affront to the court's dignity and prestige. They also believed they must take a definite stand against lynch law. The members of the court agreed that their most likely action would probably involve some sort of contempt charges brought against the sheriff, his deputies, and possibly members of the mob. However, the justices all agreed to study the law and make recommendations the next time they met, which wouldn't be for another 2 weeks. On their previous Wednesday, just 2 days after the lynching, United States Attorney General William Moody had met with President Roosevelt to discuss it. Both believed the men who had participated in the mob should be punished. At a morning cabinet meeting, the president had waved a handful of telegrams from concerned citizens of Chattanooga, begging the president to allow local law enforcement to handle the matter. They promised the leaders of the lynchings would be dealt with severely, and also claimed that federal intervention in this matter would only incite a race war in their city. Moody told Roosevelt their options were limited. They could simply ignore the matter, allowing the Supreme Court to do whatever it wanted, and permitting the state authorities to make their own investigation. However, Moody said that in the political and legal climate in Chattanooga, it might be impossible, or at least highly unlikely, for a local grand jury to indict those responsible for Johnson's slaying. If an indictment were obtained, it was highly unlikely that an all-white male jury would convict the perpetrators. An alternative, he said, would be for the federal government to conduct its own probe and impanel a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Tennessee to bring conspiracy charges against the members of the mob and the local authorities. He cited a specific law passed by Congress in 1871 that made it a federal crime for, quote, 2 or more persons to conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any citizens in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or laws of the United States, unquote. The law provided that anyone convicted of this crime would receive up to 10 years in prison and be fined $5,000. That federal statute, Moody said, could be construed to fit the facts in the Johnson case. A final possibility, the Attorney General stated, was to conduct a federal preliminary investigation, allow the local officials to complete their inquiry, and support the Supreme Court in whatever endeavor it might pursue. If later the Justice Department determined it should proceed with criminal charges, it could do so. President Roosevelt said the third option sounded most logical, and ordered it done. That afternoon, less than 48 hours after Johnson was killed, Moody sent a pair of Secret Service agents to Chattanooga to begin collecting evidence in the lynching. The federal agents were told to make a preliminary report and file it with the United States Department of Justice as quickly as possible. In consultation with the members of the Supreme Court, it was agreed that any federal charges would wait until the local authorities in Hamilton County had completed their investigation. Back in Chattanooga, city leaders continued to bombard officials in the nation's capital with letters, telegrams, and lobbying efforts. Congressmen from Tennessee made personal visits to the offices of Attorney General Moody and President Roosevelt. Their message was quite clear: leave us alone. A week after the lynching, the people of Hamilton County went to the polls. In the weeks leading up to the election, most political observers felt Sheriff Shipp would lose his seat. There was great discontent among the local citizens regarding his handling of the Johnson case. Many people believed he had not complied enough with the community's wishes. He had not complied enough with the community's wishes when he sought to protect Johnson from the mob during the first lynching attempt, that he should be given to the demands of the mob. In other counties, they pointed out, the sheriff frequently participated in lynchings by handing the prisoner over directly to the mob. However, public sentiment shifted dramatically in the days immediately following Johnson's lynching. Not only had Shipp not stood in the way of the mob's second attempt, but the federal investigation being conducted made him a martyr. In fact, supporters sought to use the lynching to galvanize white voters in their support for Shipp. The best example came in an editorial in the Chattanooga News 2 days prior to the election. Quote, "Sheriff Shipp ought to be reelected by the white voters of the county. When we remember that the issue against him in his course in the Johnson case, there ought to be enough Anglo-Saxon manhood in the county to elect him. He should be given one of the largest majorities in the history of the politics of the county. His defeat would be entirely too much encouragement to the defenders of such fiends as Johnson was. We repeat that we do not understand how a white man can withhold support from Sheriff Shipp under all circumstances. That he will be elected, the news was no doubt, but his majority should be large enough to forever bury the crowd that has sought to make capital out of the Johnson case. It should be large enough to show the whole country that this county proposes to stand by a sheriff who believes in protecting the womanhood of the South." Unquote. The racially divisive campaign worked. The citizens of Hamilton County re-elected Joseph F. Shipp by the largest margin of victory ever recorded at the time. He was immediately sworn in for a second 2-year term as sheriff. Community leaders in the newspapers tried to portray the voters' overwhelming support for Shipp as a message to officials in Washington, D.C. That federal interference in the Johnson case was not welcome. A month later, Judge McReynolds called the Hamilton County Grand Jury into session to investigate the break-in at the jail in Johnson's slaying. With District Attorney Matt Whitaker handling the presentation of the case, more than 35 witnesses were subpoenaed. The sheriff, all of his deputies, and dozens of others gave statements. Not one of the witnesses called to testify before the grand jury was able to identify a single member of the lynch mob. Even Sheriff Shipp and jailer Jeremiah Gibson, who spent more than an hour with the leaders of the mob, were unable to remember a single person who was involved. None of the black witnesses to the raid on the jail and in the lynching were called to testify. In the end, the grand jury probe was dropped. Shipp, McReynolds, and Whitaker announced that no charges would be brought. There was no credible evidence to indict anyone for the raid on the jail and the lynching, they said. With that, the leaders of Chattanooga sought an end to this ugly chapter in its history. A few days following the lynching, the Reverend T.H. McCallie had sent word to Noah Pardon that he wanted a private meeting with a young lawyer. The two had gained tremendous respect for each other during the past month. Though large segments of the community did not appreciate Dr. McCallie's sermons, condemning their racism and separatist views, he was not easily swayed. He spoke the words that God placed in his soul. The minister feared Pardon's life was in danger, and he recommended that the lawyer flee town with his wife until tensions calmed. Pardon's defense of Ed Johnson had made him a hero within the black communities throughout the county. After all, he had been to the U.S. Supreme Court. He was flooded with requests to speak at black churches throughout the South, the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and other educational institutions begged him to talk to the students and faculty. Black-owned newspapers and magazines from across the country pleaded with him to write articles for them. Ida Bell Wells, the prominent black newspaper publisher from Chicago, asked him to write an editorial about lynchings and the law. At home, it was a different story. The two black lawyers became immediate outcasts in Chattanooga. They were labeled troublemakers. These two lawyers, who had represented so many black people for 2 decades, most of the time for free, now found themselves being blackballed. They had expected white people to cause them trouble, but now black business owners who depended on white customers fired Pardon and Hutchins. Black people no longer stood in line outside of their law offices seeking representation. The people of their own race were reluctant to hire them for one reason. The white lawyers and judges in town despised them. No one wanted to hire a lawyer who was hated by the judge. Potential clients feared they would receive a tougher punishment if Partner Hutchins was their attorney. The pair had rocks thrown at them through the windows at home and at the office. There were constant threats against their lives. The sheriff refused to send deputies to investigate when either man called for help. Finally, Pardon and Hutchins saw no other path to pursue but to pack their belongings and find a new home. Both men hoped they would be able to return to Chattanooga someday. Quote, "The white men of the South claim that the Negro is the only criminal. Yet, in this case, the Negro fought on the higher plane, while the white man depended on his brutality. As lawyers, we've been threatened, and the city is in an uproar against us as bedlam reigns." The Sunday following the lynching, Reverend Jones of the White First Baptist Church preached a very strong sermon against lynching. He was notified through several letters that if he did not retract the statements made in that sermon, that the mob would call on him. This he refused to do. The following Saturday night, actually Thursday, April 5th, his house was set on fire. Never before in the history of this country has lynching been brought so plainly within the power of the federal government to punish the perpetrators. Johnson, at the time of his death, was a federal prisoner. It is now up to the federal government to deal out justice. Unquote. Noah Pardon. Farewell address to a Chattanooga church, printed in Voice of the Negro, April 14, 1906. $236. Thank you for coming. Appreciate you.